Hey there, tiktakers! Since the premiere of the film directed by Juan Antonio Bayona, Society of the Snow, there have been multiple headlines recalling the terrible real event that occurred in the Andes more than 50 years ago. A story told by the survivors full of pain, despair, death, and even cannibalism. Whether you have already seen the film or not, we invite you to learn many more details about this case. We warn you that it will leave you completely dismayed. It all started when members of the Old Christians Club amateur rugby team from Montevideo, Uruguay, had to play a match in Santiago, Chile. The president of the club, Daniel Juan, decided to hire a plane from the Uruguayan Air Force to fly to the Chilean capital. The aircraft was carrying 40 passengers and 5 crew members. There were 10 additional seats, and the team members invited some friends and family to join them. One of the players missed the flight, and Graciela Augusto de Mariani bought the vacant seat so she could attend her eldest daughter's wedding. She wasn't one of the passengers who would initially fly on that plane, and she didn't know any of her traveling companions. Everyone took a photo before leaving, something that those of you who have seen the movie will surely remember, and that image was real. The plane departed from Carrasco Airport on Thursday, October 12, 1972. But a storm front over the Andes mountain range forced them to change the flight plane and land and spend the night in Mendoza, Argentina. The next day, October 13th, the conditions over the Andes hadn't improved, but a colleague who had just landed in Mendoza from Chile assured them that it was safe to fly, and then they ended up making the decision. On the other hand, a foreign military plane couldn't remain on Argentine soil for more than 24 hours. And at 2:18 p.m., they took off from Mendoza. The pilot, Cesar Ferradas, had already flown through the Andes 29 times. And on this flight, he was training Dante Héctor Lagurara, who was the pilot in command. The flight route was decided from the beginning. Cross the Andes through the Planchon Pass, which was the safest route when visibility wasn't good. As they flew over the Andes, clouds covered the mountains. Given the poor visibility, the pilots flew with the help of instruments because they couldn't visually confirm their location. The cloudiness and wind caused them to have to reduce speed from 210 to 180 knots. At 3:32 p.m., Lagurara contacted air traffic control in Santiago de Chile to tell them that they could see Curicó and that they were proceeding to turn at right angles to head north towards Santiago. This is where the tragedy began. The control tower accepted this information as good and authorized them to descend to 3,500 meters high. But in reality, since they had slowed down, the plane hadn't yet crossed the Andes, but was in the middle of the mountains. Passengers moved happily along the aisle and changed seats to see the mountain ranges from the windows, when suddenly they began to notice a strong turbulence. At first, they thought that everything was normal, and some even joked, until from the windows they began to see the snowy peaks very close. Soon, the engines began to roar, the pilots desperately trying to regain altitude. Shortly after, a roar was heard and the plane hit a mountain. First, one wing broke, then the other, and the brutal impact split the plane into two. The tail, along with the passengers in that area, were thrown hundreds of meters away, all dying from the crash. The front of the plane slid down the slope and came to an abrupt stop. Of the 45 who were traveling, 32 remained alive, although many of them were seriously injured. Survivors removed broken seats and chunks of the plane and turned the fuselage into a makeshift shelter for the night, because temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees. To protect themselves from the cold, they used luggage, seats, and snow to close the entire broken and open part. During the first night, several more victims died, leaving 28. Survivors remember it as the worst night of their lives. Very cold, screams of agony, and having to sleep next to dead friends and family. Hoping to be rescued as soon as possible, they began to improvise various gadgets. They needed to quench their thirst, so they placed snow on top of metal sheets and when it melted in the sun, it dripped as water into empty wine bottles. To avoid the well-known snow blindness, they improvised sunglasses using the cockpit sunshades, wire, and a bra strap. The seat covers, which were made of wool, were also torn off and used to keep warm. Their ability to organize and work together kept them alive. One of the survivors, Nando suffered a skull fracture that caused him to remain in a coma for 3 days. On the 3rd day, he woke up and learned that his mother had died and his sister, Susana, who was also there, was seriously injured. He did everything possible to keep her alive, but on the 9th day, the young woman died. Meanwhile, the world remained shocked by the news that their plane had disappeared. Search and rescue services were put into action and several planes went out to search the area. Some flew close to where they were. The survivors saw 3 planes, but they couldn't get their attention and none of them saw them. After 8 days, the searches were called off, as the harsh conditions gave little hope that anyone would be left alive. They expected to find the dead bodies in the summer, which there begins in December, when the snow melted. Meanwhile, survivors found a small radio transistor between the seats of the plane. They were able to get it working, and on their 11th day on the mountain, they heard the news that their search was over. The victims reported that at that moment several began to cry, others to pray, knowing that no one would save them, that their hopes of being rescued were over. However, Coco approached the companions who still didn't know anything and said, "Guys, there are good news. They have cancelled the search." Everyone remained silent. Then they began to cry. Why would that be good news? Coco stated, "It means we are going to get out of here on our own." And that pushed them to not give up and look for an alternative to get out of there. The travelers had little food. 8 bars of chocolate, a can of mussels, 3 jars of jam, a can of almonds, dates, candy, dried plums, and several alcoholic bottles. The first few days, they divided the food into very small portions so that it would last as long as possible. Nando, for example, ate only 1 peanut dipped into chocolate for 3 days. But still, the food ran out. There were no plants or animals on the glacier. The food ran out after a week, and the group tried to eat parts of the plants such as the cotton inside the seeds and the leather, toothpaste, and even made tea with tobacco. Although none of that gave them energy, and they became sicker and sicker. After the survivors learned that the search had been called off, and faced with hunger and death, some began to suggest eating the bodies of their dead friends. It was something that made them shudder, but they knew it was the only way to survive. Therefore, those who were still alive agreed that if they died, the others could eat their bodies to stay alive. The group survived by jointly deciding to eat meat from the corpses. This decision was not easy, because most of the dead were classmates, close friends, or family members. Canessa used broken glass from the plane's windshield as a cutting tool. He set the example by swallowing the first strip of frozen human flesh. Little by little, others did the same, although some still refused to eat it. Parrado protected the corpses of his sister and mother, and they were never eaten. With the other corpses, they dried the meat in the sun, which made it more edible. At first, the experiences scared them so much that they could only eat skin, muscles, and fat. When the amount of meat decreased, they also ate hearts, lungs, and even brains. All the passengers were Catholics. Some feared eternal domination. Javier Methol and his wife Liliana were the last to eat human flesh. The latter had strong religious convictions, but they had no choice but to eat. It was that or choose death. 17 days after the crash, an avalanche hit the part of the plane containing the sleeping survivors. Snow filled the fuselage and killed 8 of them. They were buried and trapped inside. They were running out of air. One of them found a metal post from the roof racks and was able to make a hole in the roof, giving them ventilation. With great difficulty, 2 days later, they dug a tunnel from the cabin to the surface, only to encounter a snowstorm that left them no choice but to stay inside the fuselage again. For 3 days, the survivors were trapped in the small buried space approximately 1 meter high, next to the corpses of those who had died in the avalanche. With no other option, on the 3rd day, they began to eat the flesh of their deceased friends. Before the avalanche, some of the survivors insisted that their only way to survive would be to climb the mountains and seek for help. They made several short expeditions in the first weeks without success. On one of these expeditions, they found the tail of the plane where they found luggage containing a box of chocolates, 3 meat pies, a bottle of rum, cigarettes, clothes, comics, and some medicines. They also found the plane's 2-way radio, and after several failed attempts to make it work with some batteries, they gave up. And they understood that their only way out was to climb the mountains. On November 15th, Arturo Nogueira died, and 3 days later, Rafael Echavarren died, both from gangrene due to infected wounds. Numa Turcati, who didn't want to eat human flesh, died on December 11th, weighing 25 kilograms. And those who remained knew that they would also die if they didn't find help. They had to climb the mountains. Although for that expedition, they needed to find a way to avoid freezing at night. So they came up with the idea of using the insulation from the back of the fuselage, copped wire, and the fabric that covered the air conditioning and sewing a sleeping bag. They reserved the best clothes and the best food rations for those who went out in search of help. Everyone encouraged Parrado to climb the mountain, although none volunteered to accompany him. Finally, Parrado persuaded Canessa, and together with Vicentin, the 3 headed to the mountain on December 12th, 2 months after the accident. After ascending a steep mountain with little oxygen, on the 3rd day they reached the summit. They thought that from there they would see the green valleys of Chile, but they could only see mountain peaks in all directions. That meant they were still dozens of kilometers away. They were running out of food. They didn't realize that they were so far away, so Vicentin agreed to return to the accident site so that the other 2 would have more food and could arrive. Parrado and Canessa at the top saw nothing but snow-capped mountains. But suddenly, Parrado saw 2 smaller peaks on the horizon, which didn't have snow. He was sure it was their only way out of there. They walked several more days and found a river, and little by little, signs of human presence began to appear. First, some evidence of camping, and finally, on the 9th day, some cows. On the 10th, they saw a man on horseback on the other side of the river. It was Sergio Catalan, a mule driver who took them to his farm and transmitted the news to the authorities and rescue teams. When the news broke, an avalanche of international reporters arrived at that point to interview Parrado and Canessa. The Chilean Air Force provided 3 helicopters to assist with the rescue. Parrado went in one of them to guide them, and another of the planes stayed behind in reserve. The 2 helicopters carrying search and rescue personnel reached the survivors. Due to height and weight limits, they were able to carry only half of them. And 4 members of the search and rescue team volunteered to stay the night with the others remaining on the mountain, who were rescued in the morning. They were all sent to hospitals. They had multiple injuries: dehydration, frostbite, broken bones, malnutrition. When they were rescued, they were asked how it was possible, and the survivors said that they had eaten some cheese and other food they had brought with them, as well as plants. They had planned to tell only their family about the cannibalistic acts privately. However, shortly after the rescue, rumors circulated that the survivors had murdered the others for food. And sometime later, photographs taken by members of the relief corps of a half-eaten human leg were published on the front pages of 2 Chilean newspapers. Finally, the survivors recounted the events. Initially, they received a negative public reaction, blaming them for being cannibals. Shortly after, they explained the pact they had made among themselves to sacrifice their flesh if they died to help others survive. And people gradually lowered their criticism. In fact, a Catholic priest heard the survivors' confessions confirming the legality of resorting to eating their bodies, given the extreme survival situation. The important thing was not how the man ate his friend, but how the friend had given his body to the man, so that the other companions could get back home. Going from a horrible act to a gesture of humanity. To this day, except for Javier Mezol and José Luis Nicolás Inciarte, who died in 2015 and 2023 respectively, due to cancer, all other survivors are still alive. Their story was told in numerous publications, interviews, and films. As curiosities of the recent movie Society of the Snow, several of the real survivors made cameos in the fiction. One of them, the real Roberto Canessa, plays the doctor who assisted himself upon arrival at the hospital. And on the other hand, the real Carlitos Páez gives life to his own father in fiction, where he appears reading the list of survivors. His cameo is in gratitude to a father who never stopped looking for his son, because even though the months passed, Carlitos' father always seemed hopeful of finding him alive. Also, a very curious fact is that several scenes of the film were filmed in the exact place of the accident, and at the same time of the year, trying to capture the maximum dose of reality in fiction. An incredible story of how 16 people formed a union of support and collaboration and managed to defeat death for 72 days in extreme conditions. One of the most incredible true stories ever told. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it. And if you want to see more Draw My Life videos, subscribe to our channel. See you in the next episode!